Hello and welcome to Catacris TV. My name is Jason J. Rock Houston, and we're coming to you today from Los Angeles, California. And our special guest, Howard Johnson, who's the lead singer of the band Dawn After Dark. You're in Europe today, and could you share with our audience what part of Europe you're coming from today?
Yeah, I'm coming right at you out of Toulouse in the southwest of France.
Right. Don't you love modern technology? Don't even have to be in the same part of the world, and you can do an interview like this. And I got to thank a friend of mine because up until recently I was doing old school interviews like over the phone, and so my friend really encouraged me to kind of learn this technology, and I've really embraced it. It's been a lot of fun. So, I once wrote up a review for your album for knac.com because I do that too. So it's a great pleasure to finally be talking to you, Howard. And let's talk about the band Dawn After Dark. When was the band initially formed?
It's a great question and a long answer. Dawn After Dark was originally formed in 1986
Oh, wow.
in Birmingham, England, the home of
Black Sabbath.
heavy rock music.
Yeah.
And it was at a strange time in the evolution of rock music in England. The hair metal thing in LA had kind of not really taken off in the UK for many reasons, but not least of which is it would be very hard to imagine walking around with your hair 6 feet high and spandex trousers in the industrial city.
Yeah.
So there were two scenes really that were very influential at the time. One of them was a traditional kind of hard rock heavy metal scene, and the other one was what was called in the UK an alternative scene, which was basically bands that played what you could loosely call rock music, but they did it in a very different way to what would be, the stuff that was played on American radio at the time. And by that, I'm talking about bands like the Cults, New Model Army, The Mission, the Sisters of Mercy, Killing Joke, that kind of stuff. And Dawn After Dark started really as a band that was very influenced by both those scenes. We really liked the energy and the power of rock music. We were probably less excited about some of the cliches that went with it.
Yeah.
And we particularly liked the fact that the alternative scene in the UK was very innovative in terms of songwriting and in terms of the approach to the music. So the idea behind Dawn After Dark was really to try and combine those two things, to play with the power of a rock band, but write songs that were more interested and more able to embrace that alternative scene that was in the UK at the time.
I mean, that's very interesting because those type of bands are almost kind of opposing opposites. I mean, your publicist and our mutual friend, the Lord of PR, he was sharing with me that a pivotal time in your life was when you saw Motorhead for the first time, and you look at a band like Motor, it's kind of what is metal, what is hard rock. I mean, Motorhead was considered a metal band, but they were kind of really one of the heavier bands. And then you look at, go back to the time you're talking about, the mid 80s, Bon Jovi, because he had long hair, was considered heavy metal, It just kind of depends on what you define as metal,
It was a very weird time, and maybe it was to do with the fact that social media didn't exist in the way that it does now. Just as you were talking about the ease in which we can communicate and we can talk now, that just didn't exist at that time. So kind of in England particularly, the rock scene was very underground. Perhaps American people who grew up with magazines like Kerrang will think that it was slightly different, but it was a minority sport. There was no rock music on the radio. Kerrang was pretty much the only magazine that covered hard rock. And so a lot of those people who liked that music bonded together over the fact that they were outsiders. But because everything wasn't broken down into subsections, if it was kind of like Kerrang, it was one magazine that covered a real breadth of stuff. And it wasn't unusual in the UK to have people who listen to Metallica and listen to Bon Jovi at one and the same time. And now that seems really weird because those musics have nothing in common. They're completely different.
I think part of the reason for that is, the story of hard rock and metal has always been kind of, the musicians have played and the people that love to listen to it, it's always kind of been the underground, the underdogs, if you will. And even in the early 90s when grunge, people kind of say grunge killed hard rock and that, it's one form never music that never totally went away. I mean, it's still here. People still support their metal bands and stuff. Um, and I think even though, the music scene may change every decade, every 10 years, the metal fans stay true to their music, for the most part.
I mean, rock music's in a weird place now, isn't it? In that, in that era we're talking about when Dawn After Dark first formed in the mid '80s, certainly in America, rock music was the predominant music, and
Sure, sure.
commercially, it was a juggernaut. It was the music that sold the most in America, and
And
it
the interesting thing
generated
is,
unbelievable revenue.
That's as MTV was launching, but now MTV is a thing of the past, doesn't even exist, and bands are still able to get their music out there.
Yeah, and that was a big generator of revenue. So the record industry, certainly in the United States, was very focused on hard rock music, whereas now, I mean, you've got a whole situation where record companies find it very difficult to be able to
And
make
you're
money
lucky
out
if
of
you even
music.
got a record deal, right? These days, I mean,
Yeah,
they
I mean,
almost don't exist.
absolutely.
They almost don't exist.
There's a whole different world, and so you say that the rock fans are still there, and to a certain degree that's true, but it's very difficult for new and emerging rock bands to be able to make it financially viable. I mean, I've been seeing there've been an awful lot of American rock bands who've been cancelling tours to
Oh,
to
sure,
Europe
sure, sure.
because there's just no way for them to be financially viable. And particularly with COVID, the deals that were struck prior to COVID,
Yeah.
and now there's been an economic downturn, and so the deals that were struck then don't make any sense because the cost of
Yeah, yeah.
transport, the cost of accommodation is so much more expensive now.
Even look like at a classic rock band like The Who. Okay, I mean, they're kind of getting ready to wind it down, and Roger and Peter, the only two surviving band members. But I was reading an article where Roger Daltrey recently said that even for a band like The Who that still makes a ton of money, it's almost he says like we may just from now on tour Europe. It's our home country, and we make more money just touring in Europe than we do touring the United States these days. And that's just when you hear something like that, it's like, wow.
Yeah, and obviously, if you look at a band like ours, which is nowhere in the same league,
Yeah, yeah.
it's really difficult to make it pay. And fortunately, we do it for the love, and we're in a position where we're a certain age, so we're not kind of trying to reinvent the wheel and make a
Yeah, yeah.
career out of the band. We do it for the passion and for the love. But I know a lot of people who are what you might call kind of mid-range rock bands who are finding it really difficult to make money, and it makes me very glad that that we do it basically for the passion of it, and
Sure.
any money that's made out of the band gets put back into the band.
And then Dawn After Dark has a really interesting story because let's talk about the point in time when you guys decided to kind of shut the band down for about 30 years, and then I understand in 2019 you kind of had a huge comeback, and that you were a little bit surprised that after you played your first performance after 30 years, you got a pretty positive reaction from the fans at that gig.
Yeah, it was a very strange time. I mean, I was in Dawn After Dark from 1980, early 86 until about 1990. And we had a deal with an independent record label in the UK called Chapter 22, which put out records by The Mission, bands like Balaam and the Angel, Pop Will Eat Itself. I don't know how familiar your listeners would be with that, your viewers. But it was quite a well-respected label in the UK. We put out 3 12-inch singles on that label, and we're preparing to do an album. And then there were various, the usual splits and personality disorders, what have you. And got a long story short, I left the band, and then the band kind of carried on with a new guy, but disintegrated within a year. And that was pretty much it. And I kind of put it into the.
As far as the band carrying on with a singer for a while, I'm assuming the fans weren't too accepting of that, or how did you feel about the band carrying on without you?
I think I look back on it now, and of course, that there was a lot of antagonism and bitterness about, things that, frankly, young people, because we were all in our early 20s, and young people fall out with it. As a much older and more mature person, you probably look back and think it was totally unnecessary. I wasn't really concerned about whether the band decided to carry on. I think part of the problem, and Tony, who's the original drummer, who's still with us today, would be the first to admit, I think that they changed the style of the band, because, as I say, the band was really kind of, the notion and the idea behind it was to be a hard rock band that had listened to alternative music. And I think when I left the group, there was a bit of an upsurge in that kind of grimy
Yeah.
hard rock stuff like the Almighty and Zodiac Mind Warp and that. And I think the band tried to go in that direction. It didn't really work for them. And you know, I always felt that a band stays true to its sound, its original sound. It kind of, you can feel it in the grooves, and people know if it's genuine and from the heart. And I think probably that was the problem, in that the band tried a different approach to fit in with what was going on with the music instead of doing the music that was kind of really in their hearts.
I mean, like you said, you guys have a kind of a real AC/DC vibe to your music. And interestingly enough, I was reading your song Maximum Overdrive. The original version of that was actually produced by Stevie Young, who, of course, is Angus and Malcolm's nephew, and he's a guitar player now in AC/DC. So, how did that opportunity come about to work with Stevie?
That's a really good story. I mean, you're right. The band does have a lot of AC/DC influences because, as I say, our idea was always to play like a hard rock band, and we loved the stripped down sound that AC/DC had, particularly, you know, frankly, prior to the great success. I mean, we were really heavily influenced by the Power Age album. That was kind of what we thought was as good as it got for
It's really
AC/DC.
raw AC/DC at its
Yeah.
core best. I mean, and the interesting thing is, I mean, even Power Age is more of a kind of different sounding AC/DC album, because typically AC/DC, they're one of the few bands that can get away with like every record sounding the same. I mean, it works for them because I guess it's a good sound, it's unique, it's simple three chords. And that's the interesting thing. People tell me, you listen to an AC/DC song and people think they're just kind of like simple chord patterns, but they're really, if you're a musician, it's, a little more difficult than most people think it is to play that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I always really liked Power Age because I thought that it sounded like a kind of R&B type band playing with really overdriven guitars and really powered up amps. It didn't feel to me like what you might consider a classic heavy metal band, a Judas Priest or an Iron Maiden. You know, it had more swing to it, and Dawn After Dark was very much a band that wanted to have swing in the music. But to explain how we worked with Stevie, it's a good story because we had a rehearsal room in the centre of Birmingham, and it was actually owned by Stevie and a singer who he played with in a band called Starfighters. I don't know if you're aware of Starfighters.
No, I have to look them up.
They were a band that were doing a style of music that was pretty similar to what AC/DC were doing, and they were a local band in the Birmingham area, and Stevie was in the band, and the lead singer was a guy called Steve Burton, and they owned a really scuzzy rehearsal place in the centre of Birmingham, and we started rehearsing in there and then became friendly with Stevie. And then when it came to, we wrote Maximum Overdrive, we kind of felt it had an AC/DC vibe to it, and so we asked Stevie if we produce it, and that's how we ended up working together.
And another interesting kind of AC/DC connection is talking about the album they put out, which was like a greatest hits album. AC/DC, I'm talking. It's called Maximum Overdrive for Stephen King's movie of the same name. And it's interesting that you guys have a song that Stevie Young would produce called Maximum Overdrive.
Yeah, well, I don't know what came first, whether we came before the compilation or what, but maybe they stole the idea off us.
Yeah, who knows? Wouldn't that be something, huh? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you got a really interesting story, Howard, because I don't know how aware people are that so after you left, no, I think it was 1981. You started also writing for Kerrang magazine. So that's kind of interesting because you go from being a musician to kind of doing rock journalism, which is, so you're kind of on the other side of it now.
Yeah, well, it was kind of the other way around, actually. I started writing for Kerrang when I was very young. I was turned 17 when I started writing for Kerrang in the early 80s.
Wow.
And then I started Dawn After Dark when I was 21. So it was really my love of writing and seeing so many rock bands that I liked, and getting to know some of the people who were involved in the bands that kind of inspired me to start the band. So really the writing came first.
Interesting. Wow.
Afterwards.
Yeah.
And the thing about, I look back on it now and rather stupidly, I tried very hard to keep the two things separately. I wanted to keep my music journalism on the one hand and the band stuff on the other. Whereas, of course, what I really should have done was used all my music contacts to plug my band, which would have been a much more sensible thing to do. But for whatever reason, at the time,
now when you were interviewing people working at Kerrang, did this was, you said a little before Dawn After Dark, but I understand for a period you were doing both. So would you ever interview people and they'd realize, oh, hey, you're a musician too, or you're in this other band?
Yeah, I mean, people would know about it, and particularly, I got close with the Cult because I was, good friends with Billy Duffy, and they knew about it, and knew that the band was there. But I should have been working far more on using my contacts to twist arms to get
Well, they
support
say
shows.
2020 is always,
2020 is always 2020 hindsight is always a good thing.
yeah, but yeah, I mean, who knows? I mean, who knows? You could have made connections for your band and maybe got a little more exposure. But you did. I love the fact that you were on both sides of it. Did Dawn After Dark ever get covered in Kerrang by any of the other people writing?
Yeah, we did. We got two big features in Kerrang at the time when we put singles out. One of the second single we put out was called The Groove, and then when we put Maximum Overdrive out, which was the third single, we got good coverage in Kerrang. I mean, the band was liked. I think people appreciated the fact that it was just slightly different to a lot of the stuff that was going on around there. But people who like their rock
Yeah,
music
and as you say, hindsight is 2020. But um, I could understand too. You wanted to kind of keep the two things separate. You wouldn't want people thinking, okay, I work at the magazine here, and then I'm going to get my band covered here. You want to try to, keep it separate. I could kind of see that, or at least so you had that professional look.
Yeah, I think that's true. Of course, when you realise how hard it is to make any progress in the music business, you probably want to use every contact and asset that you have. But that was the way it worked out. And as I say, we put out the 312 inches before it went before it kind of went wrong. But the whole coming back together again thing in 2019 was just completely out of the blue. A promoter phoned us and asked if we'd be interested in putting the band back together because he was promoting a show in Birmingham, which is where the band was based, with Balaam and the Angel, who we toured with a lot in the 80s and were good friends with. And I had absolutely no intention of doing anything at all until that.
And again, like, let me ask, was Dawn After Dark, you guys were always a lot maybe bigger in Europe than you were in the United States. Talk a little bit about that and like how surprised
Yeah, I
were
mean,
you?
we were mainly UK. We didn't do a lot of work in Europe, but in the UK we were a very, very hard working band. I would say the band came together in late 85, and then we were kind of started playing live in 87. And between 87 and 90, we probably did 300 shows in the UK
Yeah,
for a
yeah.
band that was on a small indie label. That was a big deal, And we toured with a lot of bands, Fields of the Nephilim, Living Colour, Wolfsbane. We played anywhere and everywhere. I mean, we just loved playing live and felt that was the way to build a following.
And the reason I asked is because people, they got to remember that this is a big world. So just because maybe you haven't heard of Dawn After Dark doesn't mean they're not, a little more bigger in their part of the world. And like I was interviewing this guy yesterday, a singer, and he was telling me like different songs of his, people react to differently in different parts of the world. Like maybe one song is bigger in the US, and then he has a hit with another song, maybe in Japan or whatever the case may be. And again, it makes you realize, hey, there's a bigger world than just where I live.
Yeah, that's for sure. There's a great big world. I mean, we always, really wanted to get to the States because, as we discussed earlier, the fact that rock music was so much more appreciated and so much more, in the mainstream and available on radio stations, and people love to go. The gig scene was so vibrant in America at that time. Unfortunately, it just never worked out for us. But you never know. Keep your fingers crossed. One day we may still make it.
Yeah, who knows? And so because you guys are still out there doing this, so when the promoter reached out to you guys and you did that first show in 30 years back in 2019, first of all, were you surprised that a promoter like you, like, oh wow, this guy he's even still thinking about our band, huh?
Yeah, it was a weird thing after 30 years because, as I say, we didn't have any intention of doing anything. And then the most amazing part of it was we played the show and it was packed, and there were like hundreds of people out there with old Dawn After Dark t-shirts that hadn't been out of the cupboard since 1980s.
Wow, that's gotta be a great feeling.
It was just, yeah, it was like there was a lot of love in the room. And the guy who was promoter, funnily enough, by things coming full circle, he's also the owner of Chapter 22 Records. It's not a guy who we were involved with in the 80s, but he owns the label now.
Yeah.
And he was so excited that he said, you've got to do an album, because we'd always felt like we had a lot of stuff that hadn't been heard, and particularly the changes in technology now means that that you're able to record albums and really produce good quality recordings at a very low cost in comparison to how it was before. You had to go into studios and spend a lot of money back in the day. So the opportunity to do an album was really, really exciting, because we
Sure.
felt we could produce something that was really representative of what we felt the band should have sounded like in the
Yeah.
80s.
Yeah, I mean, and you look at a band like Motley Crue that, they have a huge following, and like, back in 2015 they were supposedly on their farewell tour. 5 years later they come back, and that's great. I don't have nothing against that, but like, what makes your story so much greater is that's not your story. You guys you called it a day. You hadn't played in 30 years, and then all of a sudden somebody from out of, just unexpectedly, gives you a call. Hey, we would love for Dawn After Dark to play this gig. And I imagine when you're playing that day up on the stage, you must have been a wonderful feeling, just of love from your fans. I mean, because you hadn't played in 30 years, and to see that, you probably initially thought, okay, we're just going to go have some fun, do this one gig, and then it got to the point where you guys are still out there doing it, and that's got to be, after 30 years, these people are still here for us.
Yeah, it was an amazing feeling, to be stood there watching people having such a good time, and seeing people, the joy on their faces for something that not only us but they hadn't thought was ever going to happen again. And it was very, very gratifying. And then obviously to have the opportunity to make a record and carry on and still play and be playing more shows was fantastic. And in many ways it's much more enjoyable now, because there isn't the pressure that when you're young guys and you think you're going to make it and you want to make your career out of it. Now, we do it for the love of it. We get along well. The fans love it. We play good shows. We played with Balaam again, which has been really a great thing for us to do, because we were always such good friends with those guys. And it feels like coming full circle.
Coming
And
home,
as I say, particularly the thing that I appreciate the most is we made a record that we felt was was a really strong album that we could put up against anything else that was out there.
Yeah, let me ask you, when you guys got together initially to do the one show, was there a lot of rehearsal that went, took place before the show, or?
Not a lot. We probably had 2 rehearsals, but everyone had their chops together still, and so that was it was nice to be able to get back in a room and think, okay, we think we can still do this.
And I think that speaks levels of your talent as a band and as musicians, because after not playing these songs in almost 30 years, you think you guys would be rusty, but to
You really would.
just deliver the goods, as they say, that's amazing.
Yeah, and particularly for me as a singer, you're always concerned that your voice isn't going to hold up. And actually, I went back and listened to the old recordings after we made the New Dawn Rising album this time around, and I actually prefer my voice now to how it sounded back in the day. I think there's a bit more kind of maturity to it.
Oh, wow. And you have other thing too about coming back after 30 years. You got a certain percentage of those loyal hardcore fans have been with you since day one, but then you look on the audience, there's like, there's kids that weren't there 30 years ago, or but just you got new fans as well, and that's got to be kind of a unique feeling.
Yeah, I mean, it's really exciting to every new fan that we pick up, we're very grateful for, because that's one of the plus points of having new social media, is that you can reach people that back in the 80s you just had no chance if you didn't have a huge record company behind you and top management. It was really difficult to reach those people. Now it's much easier to find your tribe, and as I say, we're always really excited and very grateful for everybody who having people like yourself from in LA who know the band and have appreciated what we do is it's really gratifying.
Yeah, we love to hear stories like this and spread the word about great bands like Dawn After Dark, and that's what we do it for. I'm not a musician myself, but I'm a huge music fan, and so that's how I kind of got into this, is just wanting to spread the word about the bands that I think people should know more about. And after I think around 91, I was told you became the editor for both Raw and Metal Hammer magazine. Now, talk a little bit about going from Kerrang to that, and what's involved with being an editor.
Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting time, because when I left the band in 90, it was really kind of, I had to decide what I wanted to do with my life. And I decided I was going to move from Birmingham, where the band was. And I ended up actually for about 18 months, I worked with Iron Maiden's management company first, because I'd known those guys for a long time. So I worked with Rod Smallwood, who was Iron Maiden's manager for a couple of years, and then got headhunted to go and edit Metal Hammer magazine. And I'd kind of missed the journalism. I really feel that the journalism thing was really my bag. and so I went off and did that, and then got headhunted to edit Raw magazine, and just found myself right back into, in the middle of of a of the 19 kind of the early 90s hard rock scene, and then also everything that came along with the kind of the Britpop music, which was Oasis and Blur and all that. And it was a really exciting time to be in London, and bands like the Manic Street Preachers, who were kind of trying to cross between those two things again, play more kind of indie music but with a hard rock attitude, and it was a really exciting time to be there, and I felt very grateful that I could use, I suppose, my position as an editor to try and introduce people to the bands that I thought were
So were
exciting.
you in charge as an editor? Are you in charge more of like the bands that are going to be featured in the issue, and you decide who's going to? Do you ever get to do any of the interviews or?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very different world at the time. I imagine now anybody who's putting something together in a commercial basis, everything will be based on algorithms and needing to know exactly what user is where and what their personal tastes are, and it'll be refined to the nth degree. And really, at the time, it was an entirely different world. The editors got free reign. They
Yeah.
were put in place because the publishers believed they knew about the music they were writing about, and you pretty much had carte blanche to do whatever you wanted, which was
Did you ever find that any of the people you were interviewing or covering in the magazines, maybe once they learned you were a musician yourself, you played in a band that would give you a little more of a connection with them, and maybe some of the other writers who were just journalists?
I think so. I think people, I mean, musicians had two ways of looking at it. I think, some of them felt that made me understand what they were going through a little bit more. And some of them probably felt that, a journalist who was a failed musician, in their opinion, might not have been the person that they felt should have been interviewing them. I don't know. I always got on well with most of the bands that I interviewed. Even the bands whose music I didn't like, I found that as I got older and more mature, I was able to be able to separate what I thought about the music from what I thought about the people. And sometimes the people who made music that I didn't particularly appreciate happened to be some of the people I got on with best.
And did that make it difficult too? Like maybe being friends with some of these musicians that you met along the way in your own musical career, like, hey, hey, could you write up a review on our album? And maybe you listed and you didn't think it was that great, but oh man, this guy's my friend. I know this guy.
I think that was always something that I needed to be clear about. And when I spoke to people, that the friendship thing was entirely different to the
Professionalism. Yeah.
publishing. I guess the only thing that I would probably have done is if they were friends of mine and I really didn't like whatever their latest album was, I personally would have avoided writing about it.
That makes sense. Makes sense. Yeah. And the
But a
other,
lot of
yeah, I was gonna say the other
a
interesting
lot of
thing
the
is, as
time,
much as we love this technology, is I think it's a shame that a lot of the like print magazines have gone away. I mean, you got like in America, you got like Guitar World, you got Classic Rock, of course, which is a European magazine. But I'll tell you, I don't really mind spending like $20 an issue on an issue of Classic Rock, because you know what? They put together a really nice magazine. It's quality.
absolutely. I mean, I don't know if you're aware, but I'm still in the journalism game, and I edit a magazine called Rock Candy, which is a kind of print magazine that
Oh
deals
yeah,
with classic rock from the 80s.
we got this bookstore in America called Barnes and Noble. They're one of
Yeah,
probably the big chain bookstores here. And in fact, I seen just on the newsstand the recent Rock Candy magazine. They had different covers, one with Gene Simmons and one with Paul Stanley. And again, very much like
that's
classic rock.
exactly right.
I don't mind. I don't mind paying for that, because it's just quality magazine, and I mean it doesn't easily rip. They put it together nice. A lot of it is kind of retro as far as these like what you consider classic hard rock bands, but that's the stuff I grew up on. So and they don't have a lot of rock magazines that cover those bands still here in America. So I would pay for something like that.
Well, it's this, it's exactly what we were talking about with the bands, is that, it's become a minority sport now, and that, we're kind of trying to fly the flag for something that, we felt very passionate about when we were young men. It's not the mainstream and it's not for everybody, but, exactly like Dawn After Dark, like Rock Candy, we're flying a flag for an era that
Yeah.
we feel very passionate about.
The last thing I want to ask you about before I let you go, I also understand we talked a little bit about what a huge ACDC fan you are and what huge influence they were on you guys. I understand you also wrote a book about AC/DC. I believe it's called "Get Your Jumbo Jet Out of My Airport."
I really did, yeah. It's all about probably about 20 years ago now that I did that, but it was born out of a kind of a real appreciation of what AC/DC were up to the point where I guess probably you'd talk about the Back in Black era. And then, I kind of fell off the cliff with AC/DC when For Those About to Rock came out. I lost my interest. It felt like a different band, because one of the things I loved about AC/DC was that kind of, like we talked about earlier, the fact that it's like an overdriven R&B band. And then by the time it had got to For Those About to Rock, and obviously they were so hugely successful, and Brian Johnson had become the singer, and Bon Scott's fun and really interesting lyrics were no longer there, and it just felt to me that it'd become kind of like another heavy metal band. So
can people still get their hands on your book, or is it out of print? Or?
Yeah, I believe so. I think if you go onto Amazon, it's still available there, and it's basically my recollections of the importance of AC/DC in my life, plus a lot of interviews with other fans and people who were really influenced by the band, up to the, like I say, kind of up to the point of really, Back in Black and Bon's death. I did touch on Brian, and I really like Brian as a singer and as a person. He's a great guy, but my love of AC/DC kind of, really.
That's just when you came up. That's your story, And I was curious.
It was up to Back in Black.
Carrying on with your rock journalism, do you do anything online? Like, do you have a site that you're posting anything that people can go to?
Well, what we do with Rock Candy Magazine is we have kind of a Facebook group that's very active with about 40,000 people who go there and talk about the music that they love. I know that everybody talks about what's happening with Substack, and I've certainly been thinking about ideas about how that might work, because obviously the people who like us, grew up in the 80s and loved that music would obviously be, really, I suppose, interested in the work that I did with Kerrang at the time and the stories that I have from meeting so many people. So that's definitely something that I'm looking at, and and as I say, Rock Candy takes up all my time at the moment, but
Sure.
I suspect there'll be a Substack thing at some point in the future.
See, that's what I love about your story, Howard. I love the fact that it's like you didn't just get into rock journalism to promote your own band and get your own name out there. You're in it for other reasons than that. Like, you want to promote the music you love, the scene that the scene that you're still a fan of, and I love the fact that there are magazines like Classic Rock and Rock Candy. The very last thing I guess we should discuss before I let you go is what is currently going on with Dawn After Dark. Anything?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've just come off a couple of dates that we did in the UK with a band called Spear of Destiny, which was another of those alternative bands who are still around, still a great band. We've really enjoyed that. We've got lots of plans coming up. Obviously, the first album, New Dawn Rising, is available on all streaming platforms, so people can have a listen to it. But we're now currently in a heavy writing phase where we're going to start work on material for the next album. We've also got a few little surprises coming up for next year that we think will be interesting. A couple of ideas that we hope will spread the word about, which can't tell you too much about now, but that's certainly happening. But we're going into a big writing phase, and the band will be hard at it, and we're looking forward to coming back with another album that will hopefully top the one we've already done.
Great to hear it. Great to hear. And I think we've just really touched the surface in your story here. And the interview we just did will be going up probably in the next few days. I'll let you know the minute it does. Feel free to share it. And I would love to have you back, because, again, I think we just touched the surface. Maybe next time I'd love to hear some of your stories about, from Rock Candy or even the Kerrang days or other stuff, and hear maybe some stories I'm sure you have from all the great interviews you've done over the years with other people.
More than happy to do it. It'd be a pleasure.
Take care, my friend. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Good talking to you. All the best.